And so we'll kick off with the very first one. And this is a classic. This is something that we get all the time. And the question is, when it comes to the literature review, how do I synthesize instead of just summarizing or describing the research? So, David, you've dealt with this a million times. What does everyone need to know?
I think that's a great question, and it's often enough a question that a lot of us get, specifically that horrible feedback from your supervisor where they say, we'd like to see more synthesis and sort of no more explanation beyond that. But broadly, what it means is we want to be engaging with the literature beyond just saying what they found. So traditionally, you're going to start off by indicating what the study set out to do, what it found, how it was done. But then you need to take it a step further. And really the best way to do synthesis is to look for those clear patterns that you're seeing in the literature. So if your topic is about, now doing an example off the top of my head, let's say remote working practices in the UAE, and you want to find out what's been said there. So a really good strategy is to make sure you're looking at what are the broad patterns that are coming out when you look at multiple studies. Are there 3 or 4 studies that have all found the same sort of pattern? If they found that pattern, then the synthesis is pulling those together. So you'd report on each of those studies and then sort of summarize what they're finding together. So you might say that within the context of the UAE, there's positive research that really indicates that remote working is associated with improved work-life balance and, more importantly, better productivity. But then the other thing that you want to do with synthesis is look to see if there's anything on the other side of the coin. Is there any studies that are disagreeing with what's been presented? And again, you want to summarize and pull those together and then start looking at what those patterns mean going forward. Is it suggesting that there's a need for more research because there's uncertainty? Is it that there is just a whole lot of research that shows one thing, but it's only been considered outside of the UAE? And so that synthesis is then seeing that pattern that across those 5 studies, the 10 studies that you cited, they're all saying remote work is positive, but none of them have looked at the context of the UAE and potentially cultural dynamics. And so that's really that synthesis aspect, is where you're looking beyond just what each study is saying and starting to look at where the studies overlap or where there is disagreement, or even probably the most ideal is where there's a gap that they haven't studied yet. That's just a high-level summary of that process. But again, you want to look at how other dissertations, other papers are specifically engaging with those topics as well. The last thing I'd mention is for synthesis, a great place to look for examples of that is in review papers, systematic reviews, narrative reviews. Those are really going to help you identify what that synthesis looks like. But I think that's sort of a high-level overview there. Any follow-up from you, Derek?
Great overview. I think I see there's just a question that's coming from Erica with regards to the literature and how one analyzes the literature. There's multiple parts to this question, but I just want to dig into what you've touched on here, Erica, with regards to the methodology. This is definitely another area that you can, or another lens through which you can look at the existing literature, and you can say, well, as the methodology very much leaned in one direction, perhaps qualitative as opposed to quantitative. Just as David said, you kind of want to look at what's missing. You want to look at where are the gaps in the research. So that's both in terms of the arguments that are being made, but also in terms of the methodology. So I want to keep moving through the questions, so we're not going to stick for too long on that one, but we're probably going to loop around in some way, shape, or form because there's so much overlap. So moving on to our second question. This is one that certainly comes up quite a bit as well, and that is, how do I align my research questions with my methodology? In other words, the thing I'm interested in understanding with the methodology. So this sort of touches on, do I use qual? Do I use quant? How does this all fit together? So David, how do students align their research questions with their methodology?
So I think first and foremost, before even that choosing methodology, it's really important to identify that gap that you're trying to fill. because that gap is going to direct your research questions, and then those research questions direct your methodology. So for instance, if you're working in a field and there's been a ton of quantitative research on the topic, but very little qualitative research, that's going to then direct your research, if you're trying to fill that gap, into that qualitative space. And then you're going to be asking questions about why, what are the perceptions, how have ideas developed in that space? And those kind of questions then lean towards qualitative. If they're very measurable, if they're very sort of trying to track something or see how something has changed, that's a little bit more quantitative. And so the first thing to do to get that alignment is to really identify what it is you're trying to answer, and then think about what are the different approaches that have been used in the past. Where is there a gap? If there's a gap, you can definitely fill in that gap, but also don't feel bad about using an approach that has already been used, but just not in your context. So first off, make sure you identify what that gap is. Make sure that your questions are set up to address that gap, and then think about the format of your questions. How are they phrased? What are you trying to collect? What is the information? And then that's going to help you identify the appropriate methodology. If you're looking to dive deep to really get rich insights, that's going to lean you towards qualitative. If you're looking to sort of assess patterns, that's going to lean you towards the quantitative side of things. And within there, there's a whole big bag of tricks for both methodologies. And really there it comes down to, again, what are you trying to achieve? So qualitatively, just for example, if you're really interested in people's experience, you might consider something like an ethnographic approach, one that's really digging into how they're experiencing a situation, phenomena, or an experience. The other way option would be maybe you're trying to identify broad patterns or big ideas in the field. That would lean you towards a thematic approach. And similarly, on a quantitative side of things, it really depends on your research question, but that question is going to drive it. If you're looking for a relationship, you might consider correlation. If you're trying to prove that a relationship exists or that one variable affects another, regression's your way to go. But if you're just trying to see if there's differences between two groups, then you might follow some standard t-tests. And that's sort of a high-level summary. Again, we would go into much more detail with coaching, providing specific direction and guidance, because unfortunately that methodology is so dependent on the context and the research question as well.
Yeah, well said. Well said. This is really a bomb of a question because there's just so many potential directions. But if I can just try to sort of summarize the key takeaway there is really, if you at the highest level, if you're looking to measure, if your research questions are about measurement, about numbers, then obviously you're going to go the quantitative route. Whereas if you're exploring perceptions, if you're exploring sort of the human experience, you're very often going to lean qualitative. Not hard and fast rules. There's, for every rule, there's an exception. And something to also just keep in mind always with these things is you also need to look at sort of what your resources are and what your capabilities are. And very often your decision in terms of methodology is going to be undeniably influenced by what you have available in terms of resources. So let's jump into our third question that was pre-submitted. This one's a great one, and it's got to do with the research gap. We've already spoken about the research gap, or we've touched on the research gap, and it's something that comes up in almost every YouTube video, blog post that we create. It's central to everything. And so the question here is, how to identify a clear research gap when the articles don't state one, or there isn't a high degree of clarity with regards to what the research gap might be?
I think there's sort of two gaps that you can always look out for. There's the explicit gaps. Those are the ones that they're calling out. Sometimes they might not specifically say this is a research gap, but they might use words and framing like future research should consider, or there is a need for more research. So those are the explicit gaps, and those are pretty easy to identify based on the paper. Generally, you want to jump into the conclusions towards the end of the conclusion. That's where they're going to really point out those gaps. But the implicit gaps, and those are often enough the more interesting ones, is the gaps that they don't necessarily mention directly. And here it's really about doing that high-level overview of the paper and what they've done, as well as comparing that to other literature. And so you might look for areas where maybe there were limitations to the study. Consider the sample size, who was represented in the sample, what all did they cover. But they might also have sections where you look at this paper and it's done a really deep dive on a concept, but it's completely skipped out an idea like cultural diversity or cultural impacts. And so you want to look for those kind of gaps as well. Then the other type of way that you can identify gaps is to think about what is other research doing in the field that hasn't been seen in that specific paper or in that context as well. And so those are some of the ways that you can sort of look for those gaps. So keep an eye out for methodological limitations. Maybe the study is purely quantitative and they've mentioned the need for further research, so it's qualitative. Think about the technical aspects of the paper, sample size, sample representation, generalizability. Basically, is it representative of the population or is it a subset? And then you also want to look at what the areas where there are concepts or ideas that haven't been fleshed out deeply due to the research approach that they've taken as well. So those are just some suggestions that you can use to help identify the gap in a paper. Generally, though, you want to be looking at the conclusions to see if they've explicitly stated them. And if they haven't, then start digging in on the methodology and the research questions as well.
Great points. Great points. Something that's worth also just highlighting with regards to research gap hunting is you want to make sure for this specific part of your journey, you want to make sure that you're looking at the most recent papers, because you don't want to be looking at papers that were maybe published 5 years ago, which is admittedly still fairly young in academic research circles, but you don't want to be looking at something that was published 5 years ago that's making the case for this massive research gap, this massive opportunity for research. You go run down that road, but turns out so has everyone else, because that was made very evident a good few years ago. So that's just something to be aware of. We do have, I think, 2 pretty good videos covering research gaps and the different types of research gaps and how to find them systematically. So you can just have a search on the Grad Coach blog, or you can just have a look on YouTube. If I'm not mistaken, if you just Google research gaps or research gap, we come up as one of the top results. So you can find that pretty easy. If not, just drop me an email afterwards. So, okay. So there's a question in the chat that's caught my eye, and you're going to hate me for asking this, David. Kathy Ann Hicks from New York City, thanks for your question. She's asking, what's the best approach for incorporating and revising the work based on feedback from your chair and committee? Because sometimes they seem to be pulling in different directions. And David, I know you've been hands on the ground, boots on the ground, coaching students directly. And this is sometimes the case, is that you're getting kind of mixed information. You're getting pulled in different directions by various people at an institutional level. So let me drop that bomb on you. What advice do you have for students? Because I imagine this is more common than we would like to admit.
Yeah, it's definitely really common, particularly when you've got a committee and you've got a committee that's not necessarily all working together. You know, it's a draft has gone to your chair multiple times, and then it goes to your subject matter expert or the methodologist, and they come in with brand new ideas. I think the first thing always to keep in mind is this is your paper. This isn't their paper. Sometimes they're your markers, sometimes they're providing good advice, but it's really important that you understand what they're asking and discern whether it is worth digging in on. I would also say, think about who your markers are, what their expectations are, because that's going to help you lean in a direction if you're not too sure. But the first thing that I would always suggest is think through what they're suggesting, and if they're conflicting in what they're saying, maybe call it out and say, hey, I appreciate the feedback that you've given. This is what you've suggested here. However, I've gotten this feedback from my other committee member. Surfacing the fact that there is that misalignment is going to make your life easier, because one of your committee members might say, oh, great, no problem, happy to drop that as well. The next thing to do is to dig in on what they've suggested and what they're asking for and how those differ. If they're asking for something about your research questions and your actual approach to data collection, think about what is going to be doable, manageable, and accessible for you. It's very easy for a committee member to say, hey, why don't we just survey 1,000 people? It's going to give us such great data, but they're not the ones doing the survey, you are. And so when engaging with that feedback, also be comfortable with saying no to a committee member or a chair, but when you do so, say it politely and then give reasons and justifications for those choices you're making. So if they're asking you to change methodology, give them justifications and reasons for why you don't think that's necessarily the best fit for your project. If they're suggesting you cite certain papers, generally speaking, that's worthwhile engaging with unless it's very far outside of the context. But I think in these contexts, it's also really dependent on what that type of feedback is. Is it big picture, methodological research question, or is it small things? If it's small things, try to find the middle ground between your committee members. If it's the big things, remember you're in charge of your own dissertation and you've got to be comfortable putting in those changes and putting them into action as well. So if they're pushing in two directions, surface that conversation, have the chat with both of them, ideally get them in the same room if that's possible as well, so that you can talk through that question. If not, a good email with both of them included in it is also going to go a long way.
Often it's an exercise in diplomacy, right?
100%.
I think it's a great points there, David. I think it's just useful to recognize that while we might operate on the assumption that everyone within the committee or everyone that is involved in your project is communicating with each other and that they're all on the same page, while we might like to live under that illusion, it's just not the case all too often. These are, first and foremost, these are humans, but very often, I know sometimes it sounds like we're really grilling supervisors and advisors on the academic side, and it's not the case. The truth is just that the system is broken, and very often that these people just have so much on their plates, and they're juggling a lot of different projects, and they're not necessarily speaking to all the stakeholders on those projects. So don't be afraid just to emphasize what David said. Don't be afraid to just diplomatically and tactfully communicate on these other people's behalf and say, thank you for your feedback. I'm a bit stretched here because I'm getting contrasting feedback. What are your thoughts on this? And hopefully that should resolve it in most cases. This is something that is more common than we'd like to admit. It's something that we deal with. Yes. We often say part of what we do at Grad Coach is like a translation service, translating what the supervisor, the advisor gives to the student, translating that into normal speak, and then being able to translate back in terms of how the student communicates with the faculty. Shouldn't be that way, but it is. But anyhow, thanks for your question. Thank you very much. So we've got another one that's come in. CJ Decker, thanks for your question. This question revolves around any tips or what's your recommended approach, David, for working smarter rather than harder, optimizing the approach to reviewing the literature. So students have got a ton of actual papers that they need to go through. Let's just focus on the sort of the first round sweep. How can they optimize that? What things do they really need to focus in on? And what things can they perhaps ignore for that initial sweep of the literature?
I think for the initial sweep of the literature, it's always very overwhelming and can feel like there's so much that you have to process. I think the first bit of advice is you don't have to read every paper 100% through. You need to arrange how you engage with those papers. So start at a high level and just look at the titles of the papers that you're looking at and put them on a list of relevant, kind of relevant, a tangent, and irrelevant. And that's going to be the first step. So just based on the title, screen those papers that you found and then put them into those groups. I would even say for the relevant, you can take that a step further and say extremely relevant or somewhat relevant as well. And my favorite way to do this is to use a spreadsheet or even a reference manager as well. So that's the first step, just doing that high level screening at the title level. Next, you want to dive in on anything that is relevant and extremely relevant, and then do a read of those abstracts. And that's where you're going to get your sort of gut feel, whether that's an appropriate paper to include or not. The abstract is going to summarize that paper and give you an idea of what did they ask, what was their approach, and what was their question and findings. And based on that, you're going to then be able to decide whether that seems relevant to your topic or if it's, again, unrelated. So when I was doing my PhD, I had a lot of papers that I had to process, and it took me a little while, but I started to identify that there was an entire field or subfield within my area of research that just wasn't appropriate or relevant to my topic. And so I was able to sort of knock out that whole pile of papers and sort of kept notes of them so that if I needed to, I could come back. But again, the focus is always on what is contributing to your research. The other thing that is helpful, and this is a bit of a tangent, is think about your research. If you're doing quantitative, what are your constructs? What are your population? Who are you researching? If you're in qualitative, what are the big ideas, the concepts that you want to work with? And then use that to help you identify the key areas that you need to cover. The other thing that can be really helpful is to chat to someone about your topic as well. It doesn't have to be your supervisor. It can be a friend, someone else in the academic space, and just say, what are your thoughts? This is what I see as common issues. And then going back to the question at hand, how do you identify? Once you've identified papers based on the abstract that you think are really relevant, are really appropriate, then don't go and read the whole paper yet. First, jump to the end of the introduction and look for the section where they present their research questions and justification for the research. That's going to give you an idea of why the research was done. Then you can jump into the methodology and focus on the sampling and the approach to data collection. That's going to give you an idea of how they addressed the research. Then you can go to the results, look at their key results. Sometimes you can even, before doing a full dive through of a paper, even skip that and go straight to their discussion. At the start of the discussion, they're going to point out their key findings, and at the end of the discussion, they're going to conclude the finding and talk about what they've done. And those are really key aspects that you want to pull out of a paper. Only once you've found papers that really meet all your criteria, then think about doing the full read through of the introduction, the lit review if it's a dissertation, because those are going to be great resources for finding related literature, but it's not going to be helping you tell you what that paper did. So those are just some suggestions from that process. The other thing that I can mention is if you are looking at a new field or you're just jumping in, look for review papers, systematic reviews, narrative reviews, meta-analyses. These are the kind of papers that summarize a wide range of papers on a topic. And so that's going to be a really good tool for you to use to just sort of catch up and identify what are the key players, what are the main studies and ideas that are happening. That can really help you to identify what to focus on going forward as well. But again, this is always a tough one to go through. It can feel overwhelming. And the last bit of advice I would add there is try not to do it all in one go. So give yourself a little bit of compassion, a little bit of leeway, set yourself some deadlines, some expectations, but then take it as you go. So thinking back to what I mentioned earlier, maybe set a day aside or an afternoon to do that high-level title screening. Then take a break. Do the abstract screening next, take a break, then do a detailed summary or assessment of those papers. Because if you're trying to do all of the papers down to that detailed coverage one at a time, it's going to feel overwhelming. It's going to feel like you're never making progress through the literature as well. But those are just some bits of advice there. Again, there's a lot more that we can dig into in terms of processes and optimal ways of engaging with the literature as well.
Thanks, David. CJRC, there was a second bit to your question that I skimmed over, and that was specifically asking about any recommendations with regards to AI and how AI can be used for all of this. I'll just jump in because I'm really fanatical about AI, and it's something that we're always exploring how we can use it here at Grad Coach and trying to understand how we can get maximum leverage from this, both for ourselves and for students. And despite my fanaticism, or perhaps because of it, I would say approach with caution. There's absolutely no shortage of AI tools, most of which are just wrappers for either GPT or Gemini. There's no shortage of research tools that are happy to take your monthly subscription money and promise to solve major problems like finding all the literature, synthesizing all the literature, bringing it all together. I would say approach with caution. I'm certainly not a laggard in this place. I'm very, very pro AI. But as I said, because we work with it so much and because we explore what can be done with these things, it's very clear that there's a lot of limitations. And one of the most obvious limitations that we find is that it just really struggles with very large bodies of text. So when you're talking about a massive article, you might find that it takes a sort of resource optimization approach where it just kind of skims. It does the skimming on your behalf. And so it actually misses out on certain things. So there's tremendous power in terms of what AI can do, in terms of synthesizing content, in terms of doing all these things that can help us. But really, it's at least right now, I'd be very cautious about relying on it. Sprinkle some on top, maybe use it to get a second view on your own analysis of the literature, but just don't own it. David, I'm sure you've got something to say.
Yeah, I would say definitely, again, use with caution. There are benefits to using it. Sometimes it's helpful for interrogating a paper just to ascertain or to figure out if your understanding is correct. But again, with any use of AI, it's really important that you manage your prompts appropriately. I always like to say AI GPTs, any of the large language models, they're designed to be helpful and friendly and supportive. They're not always going to tell you when they don't understand or when they need more information. So if you are using it, make sure to ask it clear questions and then ask it the question, do you need any more information from me? Because it's going to then be able to guide you on what information you do need. The other bit that I'll add in terms of be careful with AI is you need to interpret and understand and synthesize this information for yourself. If you're using AI tools to do the summarizing for you, that's really beneficial for speeding up the process, but it's not going to make the connections that you yourself will make. And that's going to take away your personal perspective, your specific idea. And then it's also going to make it a lot harder to defend if someone says, what did Johnson 2007, one of your key resources, say in a defense? And if you've not read the paper, not engaged with it deeply, that can be a little bit difficult as well. But I think just to put a counter to Derek's point, it's great to use those AI tools to sort of get a high-level summary of the paper, but you need to dig in deeper if it is relevant to your research as well, because that's going to be what helps you identify those gaps, how to identify what are the norms in the field as well, because that's something that we always overlook. Is reading papers can feel like a bit of an effort, but in reading those papers, we're also learning how academics write and how they present ideas. And that's going to be really helpful for improving your writing capacity as well.
Yeah, great point. I think, just to echo what you're saying is that there's at least two things that are happening when you're engaging with the literature, when you're finding out who said this, who said what's the current state of knowledge. One is just a practical task, is that you're just collecting all the Pokemons, right? You're just getting, okay, we need to know about this, we need to know about this, I need to cite this stuff in the future. But the other angle, or the other thing that you're doing, even more importantly, is that you're actually becoming familiar with the literature. You're becoming familiar with the norms that David spoke about. You're hearing people's names come up time and time again. You're seeing, okay, these are the methodological norms that using this approach, they're using whatever surveys and this type of analysis. So there's just an immersion that happens. And so AI can do a decent job, sometimes a great job, sometimes a terrible job, but on average, a decent job of that first part, which is just going and finding all the Pokemon. But ultimately, when it takes care of that job for you, and in the absence of your own Pokemon hunting, to stick with the analogy, you actually just miss out on the necessity to just become really familiar with the literature. And as David said, especially in situations where you've got to stand up and give a defense, you've got to do some sort of oral defense, so commonly the case for doctoral dissertations, that's where you really risk getting caught for not having immersed yourself in that. So yeah, let's not harp on about it. The most obvious point that I forgot to mention is just make sure that you understand exactly what your university's stance is on these things. Because universities are very, very fragmented at the moment in terms of how they're looking at this. Some of them are really embracing it, and they understand that like AI skills are key skills for the future of research and the future of, I guess, work life in general. And some are just real laggards, and they're really sitting behind the curve. So just be careful with that as well. I see a question from Liz. What's your email? Our email is hello@gridecoach.com. You can also go to gridecoach.com and book a consultation. We look forward to hearing from you. So let's jump on to our next question. This is one of my favorites, and I know David's called it. It's, broadly speaking, a question of how much is enough? How do I know when I have got enough literature? How do I know when I've got enough data? How do I know when I've done enough analysis? How much is enough, right? It's like one of the big existential questions of life, and it's certainly one of the big existential questions of your dissertation or your thesis. So David, let me drop that bomb on you. How can students think about this?
So I think that's always a really difficult question, and difficult at different stages in the dissertation journey as well, because what is enough is different for your analysis, is different for your sample size, is different for how much literature you've covered. So I'm probably going to try and tackle them a little bit separately each. But I think before anything else, the first step to get an idea of what is enough is to see what the norms are for your institution and degree. And the best way to do that is to go back and look at published dissertations, theses, whatever the study level you are at, see what has come out of your university at that level. So if you're doing a dissertation, all dissertations have to be published, so you can find those dissertations and get an idea of what are the norms for your field, for your department, for your specific degree. And so that would be the first step. And the second step is to check your guidance documents. We're always harping on about this, but check what your university's requirements are. Most universities actually have an indication of how much research they expect to see. What are the expectations of the study? So look on your guidance document. If you don't know where to find that, first contact your supervisor or committee member. They're going to be able to point you in the right direction. Check with your institution, and specifically you can reach out to your course coordinator if you're struggling to find those documentation. That's sort of the high level. See what the norms are for your field, for your department, for your specific degree. Diving in a little bit deeper, let's first say, how do I know when I found enough literature? Well, the first thing to always think about is, have I covered both sides of the argument or the idea or the concept? You've always got to make sure that you are definitely covering enough of the literature that is in favor of your approach, your specific topic, but then you also need to make sure you've looked at whether there's any disagreements, any people or studies that have found different findings. The next thing to think about in terms of the literature is, if you start finding out that as you are reading and referencing papers, that the same people are coming up again and again and again, and if you start recoming and identifying the same papers, that's a good sign that you're getting close to what we call saturation. No literature review is going to cover every paper. No literature review is going to look at all the aspects. The other thing to think about in your literature review is if you think about your research topic, what are the core ideas, concepts, or building blocks for that dissertation or for that topic? Identify those topics and then make sure you're citing relevant research that touches on each of those aspects and also the relationships and connections between them. And that should get you to the point. I think if you're getting to the stage where you're thinking, have I done enough? And you haven't started finding the same papers being referenced, then it's a good idea to dive a little bit deeper. It's also worth noting that the expectations differ at an undergraduate level, capstone, master's, dissertation, practical doctorate. So again, it really depends on the norms in the field. With regards to data collection, that is a difficult one and one that there are a ton of resources out there. If you're doing a quantitative study and you want to know if you've got enough participants, look into a power analysis. If you know what analysis, statistical test you're using, you can put in the example I'll mention is G-star power is a software for calculating this. It will tell you how much you need in terms of a sample size in order to be confident in your finding or result. From a qualitative perspective, it's much more about reaching what we call saturation. That's where, as you are interviewing people, as you are looking at what they've said, you're starting to see that no new ideas are coming up, no new findings. People aren't mentioning anything new. They're just repeating similar ideas that previous interviews or case studies have identified. Once you start getting to that point, you've reached what's called saturation, and that's a good stopping point. Again, it does depend on your institutions. Some institutions have specific expectations or requirements. Certain fields also have norms and expectations. So regarding sample size, always look at what everyone else has done before and then use that as a guide for you as well. And then in terms of how much is enough in terms of results, this is one that it's a bugbear of my own when people want to do all the analyses and cover everything. Always remember that your results need to answer your research questions. If you've answered your research questions and you've comprehensively covered what those answers are, you've done enough. Don't dive in deeper. If, however, you feel like you haven't answered a research question, then that's a sign that you need to dig deeper in that analysis as well. But that's a very big topic and one that I think is really difficult to determine based on the variability in degrees, institutions, and requirements. But that's my sort of top tips, if you would.
Well said. Well said. Just to echo something that you said right in the beginning there, the ultimate cheat code is getting your hands on previous dissertations or theses from your university for your specific program that you're completing. So if you're doing an MBA dissertation, you want to try to see past dissertations for the MBA program at your university. A lot of students aren't aware that this stuff is generally accessible. You might need to do some digging, you might need to speak to your university librarian, but very often this is available. At a doctoral level, it's probably more available than it is at a master's level because those things need to be published. There are dissertation databases out there. We've got one of the resources we've got in the Grad Coach Resource Toolkit that you can get for free on the site is a collection of dissertations for a variety of different subject matters, so across some of the most common subjects that we see. So that's a starting point. At least then you can see, okay, what does a doctoral dissertation in this area look like? But ultimately, the cheat code is, as David said, you want to go knock on your librarian's door and find out where are those past dissertations. That's where it's at. All right, let's try and squeeze in another question here. All right, let's have a look. So let's talk about something that is is actually related to everything that we've just discussed. And this is the question of, how do I know if my research topic is too broad or too narrow? So again, this is kind of a question of enough. Where's the sweet spot? How should students think about this, David?
I think first and foremost, it should be narrow enough that you're finding a gap. So you don't want to be looking at something that means that you're going to have to collect a ton of data. So going back to my really early example there of remote work, if you're looking at the benefits of remote work on productivity, that is way too broad. It's not specific enough because you're never going to be able to sample enough people to make that answer with, or come to that answer with certainty. So first off, think about, have I focused it in enough? Have I specified who my population is? Who is the specific group that I'm interested in? The other aspect to think about is, am I using enough constructs or ideas? And there's nothing wrong with using one construct, but generally speaking, if you're just looking at one construct, you're going to have to be really specific with your context. So, if you're just looking at well-being and just assessing well-being, then you're going to have to be very specific or very detailed in your engagement with that. The next thing to think about is, how do I know if I'm too specific? Well, the best bit of advice there is, if you can't find enough research to help you build up for your gap or to help you engage with related literature, you need at least 10 to 15 studies that have been done in somewhere similar, maybe a different context, maybe with slightly different ideas, but you should have enough research that's been done on your topic already that you have something to work with in your literature review. One thing to mention is, sometimes you might find a really good gap in that there has been no research done on that specific topic using either the approach you're interested in or the context that you're in. If you get to that kind of a level of detail, then it's always important to think about, do I have enough justification for going this route? Can I make the argument based on what other studies have done in different environments that this is a worthwhile aspect to focus on as well? The other thing to think about in terms of, is it too broad or is it too specific, is, can you get it done? So too broad might mean you have to sample too wide a sample, or maybe there's too many ideas you're trying to fit into one aspect. I always say a good 1 to 3 questions is really where you want to be. Having 6 to 8 questions, that's too many questions that you're asking. You're either diving too deep or too broad. So try and find that balance between there. And lastly, again, reiterating on my previous point, see what other studies have done in terms of your dissertation level, your institute, your specific field, because you'll get an idea for what the norms are for what is considered publishable and what is considered acceptable for a dissertation as well. I'm not sure if you've got any other advice there, Derek.
Yeah, great points. Great points. It definitely keep the practical in mind. We often see students coming to us with these grand ideas, these extremely broad topics, these grand problems that they're trying to solve. And we find ourselves being sort of professional wing clippers, narrowing it down. And you definitely want to err on the side of narrow. So yeah, keep it practical. Ultimately, remember that, and this is again something that we really preach with our private clients, is you want to do something simple. You want to take a simple research topic and do it really well, as opposed to taking a complex, perhaps more exciting research topic and it turns out to be too broad, it turns out to be too methodologically complex, and you end up just kind of handing in this mushy piece of work that should have been more focused and better executed. Remember that the purpose of the dissertation is, okay, so I guess this varies a little bit depending on level, but a large part of what they're assessing is, can you execute research well? So they're assessing your ability to undertake research. It's not so much about what do you find and do you create some breakthrough, do you create incredibly novel findings, although that is more important, and originality becomes increasingly important as you go up the scale towards doctorate, but they want to see that you do something well. And so this very much becomes a game of showing, demonstrating like, hey, I did a basic research project or basic methodology, and I tackled something that was very manageable, and I did it really, really well. And that's kind of putting your best foot forward. I don't know if you have any disagreement with that, David, but that's something that I always try to keep front of mind.
Yeah, no, Derek is definitely right. It's so easy to get caught up in, I want to research this really in-depth, crazy new idea. But if you don't have the resources to get it done, that's okay. You can do something initially. You can explore one aspect of it. A lot of people get stuck on the idea that their doctoral dissertation is their magnus opus. It's the last thing, their biggest contribution to the field. I'll be honest with you, as an academic, your doctoral dissertation is going to be something you put away. You'll think about it periodically, but realistically, it is just the gateway into the research world, if that is your intention. It's going to be the starting point. It's your proof of passage, your proof that you know how to do research. That's what they're assessing with a dissertation. There are certain aspects, so for doctoral level work, they do require a novel contribution to the field, but that doesn't mean groundbreaking, top of field ideas. Nobel Prize winning. It can be as simple as, I have looked at this idea in a new context. I have added to the conversation about this topic by introducing this idea. And that's perfectly fine for an original contribution to the field. Don't feel like you have to change the world. There is ample time for that after the dissertation as well. I always focus on a good dissertation is a done dissertation, and one that you are still sane at the end of the journey.
Well said. Well said. Sanity is mandatory, at least for our clients. All right, we are running up on the hour real fast. So let's wrap up with one last one. I think this is something that pretty much all students struggle with at some point in time, and that is, how do I stay organized? How do I stay motivated? How do I maintain momentum through this long journey, whether it's at a master's level project or a doctoral level project spanning over multiple years? How do students stay organized, motivated, and keeping momentum?
So there are a million things I could tell you about the process. What are the best ways to handle this? What is the best way to take advantage? But at the broadest level, I think first and foremost is identify what your timeline or deadlines look like. Set yourself a working plan based on that. So every institution has specific hand-in dates. Think about it, engage with your supervisor to identify what their hand-in dates, because those are not always the same, and then plan backwards from there. What's really helpful is to look for support or accountability partners so that you are meeting those personally set deadlines. In terms of the practical day-to-day, I think what is really important is consistency. Too many clients that I've worked with in the past have tried to get it all done. They've burnt the candle on both sides. And some of my first advice is take a weekend, take some time to yourself, find some balance, and then start ensuring you're making consistent progress. Consistent progress doesn't mean tons of progress. It means breaking down that elephant. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So make small, achievable goals. You want to build and maintain momentum. It's very easy to think, I need to do my literature review in the next 2 months, and then get paralyzed by that. However, if you break it down into, I need to finish searching for some papers, I need to identify 20 papers, that's something you can do in a week. Then you can set up, maybe I need to do planning for my literature review. And that would probably be the other bit of advice I can give, is always plan first. Plans change as you're working, but having a plan or a structure for your chapter is really beneficial for helping you to not get stuck looking at that blank page. The other area that can be really helpful is make use of a reference manager, make use of software to help you with your analysis, find the tools that other people are using in your research field to make your life easier. They've spent their time developing those tools. Don't think you need to do it all yourself. And then lastly, look for support. Not always are you going to get that support that you need from your supervisor or committee member. Derek mentioned it earlier. Unfortunately, higher ed at the moment is kind of in a difficult space. Most of our supervisors and committee members have too many students or too many responsibilities. So trying to get all you need from one source is going to mean that you're not going to get enough. So I always say, look for a writing group, look for your cohort members, have conversations about the dissertation journey with people who are going through it as well. And lastly, reach out for support if you need it. Too many people find that the dissertation is something that they have to do themselves. They have to grind through the process. They have to lose their mind in the process. And that's not how it needs to be. You can look into, we offer coaching and grad coach, but then also check out your universities. Many of them have writing centers, have student support organizations. Those are resources that you can use to ensure that you are getting the support you need. And then I mentioned it earlier, but find that balance as well. Trying to do 9 to 5 work and then a dissertation afterwards, you're going to burn out at that rate. So it's important to work in and build in some balances, some time off, some social time as well, because no human being is meant to be working and working alone. That's not going to be beneficial. But I'm sure there's tons more that we can chat about on this, but I do see we've just hit the 5 o'clock mark as well. So I'll hand over to Derek.
5 o'clock / 10 o'clock / whatever o'clock it is for everyone. Yeah. Well said, David. Just to put on 2 resources that are relevant there. We have a free dissertation project planning template that you can use. That's in the Grad Coach Toolkit. And within the same toolkit, there's also a bunch of templates. So as David said, like, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes your university will provide their own templates for various chapters or sections or whatnot, but we've got those based on the 10,000 odd students that we've worked with and what we've seen over the course of the last 7 or 8 years. So those are some resources you can check out. That's all free, gradcoach.com/toolkit if you don't already have that. And then, as David said, if you need someone to join you on this journey, that's all we do at Grad Coach. You can book a free consultation over at gradcoach.com. So that brings us to the end of this lovely little soiree. As promised, here are the details to get access to our research blueprints. So if you're not familiar with our research blueprints, these are little short courses, essentially little masterclasses in how to write a research proposal, how to find a research topic, literature review, methodology, etc. These are a great starting point if you're not quite ready for private coaching. So you can get access to that. Each of those is $200, and you can just enter this code DQA26NOE, and you will have the grand total of $0. So that's $200. There are 4 blueprints, which means you just scored $800 worth of value on top of this call. So I do hope that you have all got tremendous value from this. I hope that we've covered as many questions as we possibly could. As I mentioned, we'll send the recording, send the notes after this call. David, thank you so much for keeping this interesting and not letting me ramble on too much.
It was a pleasure. And I will say, definitely take a look at the toolkit, work on working through our resources. We've built up a large number of blog posts, tools, kits, templates. So there are a wealth of resources that you can access for free as well. But also, if you're looking for a partner, a guide, feel free to look into the coaching service as well. Our coaches love helping out people. It's what we do for joy and excitement as well. So
a final comment from the most important. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been awesome. Thanks for joining us on this very first Q&A. We'll definitely do more of them. Appreciate you all being here. If you thought this was cool, we always love a Trustpilot review. We'll send the link for that afterwards. But thank you again, and we will send the notes and the recording in a bit. Cheers.